So if we note that the situation is getting worse and it's not permanent and things are happening, emergent properties of the situation are erupting, unprecedented and often cataclysmic changes are happening, then we understand that some kind of action has to be taken quickly, but it has to be an action that is effective. And the only kind of effective action would be an internal shift of our consciousness, because the level of consciousness at which we are functioning now as egos is inadequate to the challenges of the situation we face. Once we understand that our egos are not some product of nature or of evolution, but they are a product of the devolution of culture. They are cultural artifacts. And we did not always have the kind of ego structures that we operate from and take for granted today, nor will we have such in the future. And this particular kind of postmodern ego structure, I would say, is the root cause of the problem. We must free ourselves from the identification with that ego, because what it does is censor out the full potentialities of our intelligence. And it restricts our capacity to love and to accept love because of the fear of vulnerability, fear of being hurt again. And so, although the ego desires power, it cannot get the power it wants unless it increases its intelligence, and can therefore process information, turn the information into knowledge that is accurate, and the knowledge into wisdom, and the wisdom then can be transformed into power. But we cannot go through that chain of transformation because the ego itself is blocked, and its own preconceptions, its own pathogenic beliefs cause it to misperceive information and put it into inaccurate frames of reference that do not correspond to reality as it is, but to their own projections of reality. And thus their efforts become futile and self-sabotaging and self-destructive. And so we see many seemingly intelligent people crashing and burning all around us. We see many alternative communities, many beautiful eco-villages dying. They're not dying for lack of information about how to raise food or to build appropriate architecture and all of that. No, they're falling apart because of interpersonal conflicts, power struggles, divorces, breakups of partnerships, the inability of people to remain consistent and focused, or falling into addiction and falling into lower types of acting out, anger outbursts that can't be controlled, or promiscuity, or greed, or some other inaccurate and irrational forms of behavior, the impulses to which cannot be controlled by the ego itself. The ego is not master over its own mind, its own thoughts, its own emotions, its own drives. And so until we become masters of that, the ego will remain under the delusion that it has free will, but it has no freedom at all. It has the freedom to try to get what it wants, but it cannot change what it wants to want. And this is the key, because everyone reaches a point in their life that they wish that they wanted something else. But they can't change the course of the trajectory of the ego. People who are addicted want to stop taking drugs or stop smoking or drinking too much or whatever, and they can't stop. The drive is too powerful, and it overcomes the power of the intelligence and the will. So the real question is, how do we raise our intelligence level and integrate that with willpower to be able to overcome regressive tendencies that bring us into very primitive states of consciousness in which we do things that we later regret? But without reaching a higher level of consciousness that is sustainable, then none of the things that the ego creates or enters into or joins will be sustainable either. So we do need to create sustainable communities as the culture out there collapses, and there's no time to waste in doing it. But the types of skills that we need in order to succeed in these are not simply the external skills of food raising, etc., that are part of the normal permaculture curriculum. And even though permaculture does give lip service, and I've had these arguments and discussions with Scott over a number of years when he has been here, and we've had the joy of his company at this community, but the permaculture theory will talk about the social levels, but how do we actually develop the living social skills to mediate disputes, to remain calm under pressure, to remain capable of having compassion and overcoming any drives of frustration or despair or anger? How do we remain able to function in a way that we can connect and bring about harmony when disharmony threatens to divide a community and create schisms that cannot be healed? And how can we help people to heal from their symptoms? People come wounded and suffering and with tendencies within them that they can't control, that will create forms of behavior that will produce problems for a community. There are people who just can't be friendly. They can't act in cheerful ways, or their tendencies of fight or flight will create other kinds of messes in the community that will interfere with its harmonious functioning. How do we overcome all of that? Well, we need to find a psychotechnology that will enable us to function at a higher level than the ego and overcome the ego's regressive tendencies. In traditional psychology, this was referred to as the soul level of consciousness. Okay, I don't use soul in any dogmatic religious sense, but it's a much more integrated and unified level. Above the soul, I would use the term Atman, which is the one that comes from the Vedic culture and yoga psychology. And as many of you may know, yoga is the most ancient science of consciousness. In the modern West, we have sciences developed about everything regarding the objective physical world. But the study of consciousness is still in a very infantile state. And psychology has only very recently moved out of a behavioral frame of reference, but it shifted 1 degree into a level of cognitive psychology that the mainstream uses. But the cognitive level only deals with the superficial conscious level. Psychoanalysis shows we have a subconscious that's very active and that can override the conscious mind and create hysteria and obsession and all of that your cognitive capacities to reason will not be able to overcome. We also know, thanks to transpersonal psychology and some of the pioneers like Carl Jung and others, that we do have a superconscious. And of course, all of the spiritual traditions, the mystics and the sages of all traditions have pointed to the necessity of reaching that level. But in the West, we don't have any psychotechnology aimed at it. We don't have an educational system that recognizes it. And we don't have methodologies in place to teach people that adulthood requires the transcendence of the ego to live at those higher levels. That's what the rite of passage was about in so-called primitive cultures that were much further ahead of the West in these important ways, because that's what enabled the glue of the tribe to hold together in times of adversity. Our tribes are not able to hold together, and it's all too easy to split apart because we don't have that glue. And so going back to what is that glue, for us it is prema. Prema is an ancient Sanskrit word for love. But it's not romantic love, and it's not possessive love, and it's not infatuation or possessiveness or any of the things that go under the four-letter word love for the ego. It's divine love, the love that only the soul or the spirit is capable of, love for the sacredness of life, of the earth, of being. But until we have encountered our own real being, our own essence, we will not be able to reach that place within our hearts from which real love can emanate. And so instead we only offer conditional love. And when those conditions are violated, the heart closes down and the love turns to hate. And so you can't hold a community together based on conditional love. It has to be based on a love that transcends individual likes and dislikes, and desires and favoritism and situational factors. To be able to be even capable of living with as an advocate and an emissary and a model of such love requires the transcendence of ego consciousness to a higher state in which we can recognize the unity of the multiplicity in which we dwell. If we do not recognize that all of us in our individual consciousness share the same root of one unified consciousness, in the same way that physics has demonstrated that we are all part of a unified field, and that unified field has consciousness at its most fundamental level. The world is conscious. It develops out of the movements of the quantum wave functions that are the movement of consciousness. Consciousness is there at the very root, but the ego actually filters out our awareness of that level of unitive intelligence and consciousness and creates little bubbles of foam on the waves and forgets entirely about the ocean that we are part of. So until we can break through that narcissistic bubble of individual consciousness and recognize the wave we're riding on and the ocean we all dwell in, we won't be able to unify our hearts and create a community that can survive through the kind of adversities that the world is going to be presenting us with.